So, in the week of November 10th to the 17th, the APEC summit happened. The Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit occurred in San Francisco. And of course, the big news was Xi Jinping, who arrived at November 13th, and then he held a summit with Joe Biden shortly thereafter. Many talks he presented to US businesses. There was a lot of enthusiasm about this visit. And so Xi Jinping and Joe Biden met over this week, and there was a lot of hope that this meeting would steer relations in the correct direction, meaning that the relations would soften and they would ease. Now, the results of the meeting, if were taken at surface level, were relatively fruitful. I think they fall very short on what really needs to happen for US China relations to actually become better, to actually improve, to ease. But it wasn't nothing. There were changes that were made. You had on the US side the willingness to, and here is the story with this. You had the US side willing to move a little bit on sanctions. So here the Global Times says that the US removes Chinese institutions from entity lists over narcotics, a practice to rectify errors. So the US government announced on Thursday it will remove the Institute of Forensic Science of China's Ministry of Public Security from the entity list and lift the sanctions. The decision took effect on Thursday, November 16th, according to the Office of the China Narcotics Control Commission on Friday. Experts say that China welcomes the move and believe both countries should engage in careful negotiations around counter narcotics issues. So, in a sense, you could say this is a positive move around sanctions, but let's be honest, there are hundreds of economic entities, more important entities in the tech sector, including Huawei, that are experiencing sanctions from the United States. And of course, none of that was addressed. And on the other side, on the military side, you had the US and China reestablish military communications on both sides that had been paused since that absolutely laughable balloon incident, the so-called spy balloon incident back in February of 2023, which brought relations to a historic low so poorly that Xi Jinping actually spent months and months and months, really up until this point, not taking the calls of US President Joe Biden. So it wasn't as if nothing happened during this trip. There were negotiations, there were fruitful dialogue, in both sides in their readouts indicated as much. However, as you have heard on this program over and over and over again, I have been following the diplomatic, or what I call faux diplomatic ventures of the United States toward China, because I am of not just the opinion, but I think this is supported by fact that the United States actually isn't interested in easing relations at all. That actually what it wants to do is continue its Cold War aggression toward China, with the optics simply changing ahead of the November 2024 elections. And so the United States has been conducting what I call faux diplomacy. You've had Antony Blinken. So this is about a 6 to 8 month period. You had Antony Blinken visit China, Janet Yellen visit China twice, actually, Gina Raimondo visit China. You had many US officials. You had Wang Yi come to the United States and visit Biden before the APEC summit. So you've had many of these meetings, but very little results. The most actually that China got out of these meetings before the APEC summit was a working group established by the United States and China to talk about economic issues, and perhaps some strong and lofty rhetoric about how decoupling is not beneficial for either side. That's it. That's all that China ever received. So really there weren't any concessions made at all for the Chinese side. And almost in each instance, US diplomacy was sabotaged from the very beginning. You may remember the first visit of Antony Blinken back in the spring, the late spring of 2023. He went to Beijing and the talks were very cordial, according to the readout. Then Joe Biden goes to the Western mainstream media, goes to the US mainstream media, and he calls Xi Jinping a dictator. Janet Yellen goes to China when I was in China, actually, in July. As she is going to China, the US Department of State issues a travel warning for all Americans to be careful about traveling to China. Kind of a strange thing to do when your uh, uh, Secretary of Treasury is going to negotiate with the highest levels of China's cabinet. Then you had Gina Raimondo go to China later on in the summer of 2023. And she comes back shocked at what she found when it came to the Huawei Mate Pro 60 after she had discussed how China and the US need to essentially rectify issues where they can rectify them. She comes back and she tells the media that she's shocked and appalled about Huawei's ability to build advanced chips and release a phone to skirt US sanctions. So, in each and every instance, the United States, the neocons, they undermined US so called diplomacy. They sank relations back to the level where they were before because all of this, in my opinion, is a ruse. It's an act. It's all about covering for the US's other crises abroad, Ukraine, and now you have Gaza absolutely on fire because of US failures in both regions. So let me pull up the uh, latest in what is the diplomatic catastrophe that is the United States and the neocon foreign policy establishment. So, directly after Joe Biden met with the president of China, Xi Jinping, he gave a press conference and he was asked a very specific question. And now you have to watch Antony Blinken's face because this is priceless, absolutely priceless, this reaction, because I think it gets into the reality of what we are seeing in terms of US decline and its failed attempts to maintain some kind of public relations image as it essentially sets fire to the world. So here is Joe Biden being asked a question to the press, and here is how Antony Blinken reacted to Joe Biden's response.
Mr. President, after today, would you still refer to President Xi as a dictator? This is a term that you used earlier this year.
Well, he is. I mean, he's a dictator in the sense that he is the guy who's run the country that is.
He didn't look too happy there, did he? So let's turn back the clock a little bit, okay? Let's turn back the clock because we have to see this again.
Xi as a dictator. This is a term that you used earlier this year.
Well, he is. I mean, he's a dictator in the sense.
So that's the face of the American empire crashing and burning. Now, what's interesting about this is that Blinken has played his huge role in being one of the worst diplomats, if not the worst diplomat in US history, to be thrust into many different historic crises and over again fail again and again to stabilize the US's position in the world is an utter failure, regardless of whether his role is supposed to be a stenographer and a water carrier for war, which he is, and that's what the Department of State has always been, but in recent years has intensified and become. Doesn't matter. The fact is that that's the face of failure. This is the face of failure. This is the face of the United States setting their entire position in the world ablaze. And for what? For Joe Biden? I mean, this does not feel scripted. There were the Mint Press published a video of Joe Biden in another press conference talking about Hamas. It might have been the same one, actually, getting questions about Hamas. And he starts talking about the hostages, and Blinken is shaking his head no. And Joe Biden says, "Oh, I know, Mr. Secretary, I'm not supposed to say anything else." This is what we're dealing with here. This is what we're dealing with here. So in effect, we are screwed. But this is what happened. So let's watch it one more time because we have to watch it one more time. I mean, this is gold.
Mr. President, after today, would you still refer to President Xi as a dictator? This is a term that you used earlier this year.
Well, he is. I mean, he's a dictator in the sense that he is the guy who's run the country that is country that is based on the government totally different than ours.
So there you have it. What else is there to say? It's completely undone. The United States, in just a comment to the press, completely undid what was supposed to be a relatively drama-free APEC summit. It was supposed to be a signature of the United States, where the United States, the Joe Biden administration, can talk about how it actually accomplished something on the diplomatic front, especially with China. This was supposed to be an opportunity for the United States, with all of the failures happening, the United States failing to exercise any kind of strength when it comes to the uh, 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 Gaza war, when it comes to the brutal war on Gaza, the entire region, the so-called Middle East, but let's call it West Asia. The U.S. can't assert anything. The United States, on the one hand, is announcing that it's worried about being pulled into a broader war, and on the other side is doing everything it can to ignite a broader war with Iran and Hezbollah. That's what the United States is doing. It has absolutely no control over Israel. Israel is basically doing whatever the heck it wants right now. It's doing whatever it wants. And so that's a diplomatic failure, because Netanyahu is going on the mainstream media every single day in the West, especially in the United States, and he's doing exactly what he did in U.S. Congress at the end of the Obama administration. He is lashing out at the United States, at President Biden in particular, who he never really liked because they stand on the opposite wings of the same bird of the foreign policy establishment. He is going and talking and lambasting Joe Biden, how ineffective he is, and how he can do whatever he wants, and he doesn't have any real fears in the world about the United States because they're getting blank checks. And of course, the Biden administration is exercising zero diplomacy at all. The region, too. Every single time Blinken goes to the region outside of meeting with the Israeli government, no one really wants to talk to Blinken. Why is that? Well, what are they offering? They're offering nothing. They're not allowing for any kind of ceasefire. They're not supporting what they claim to have supported for years, the UN resolution on a Palestinian state, a two-state solution. No, none of that. They're giving nothing to the region. In fact, they're escalating while trying to claim that they are on the right side of this conflict, that they care about civilian deaths and all of that. So and then there's Ukraine. They're failing in Ukraine. The Ukraine conflict is finished. It's over. The counteroffensive, forget it. It's history. We don't even have to talk about it anymore. The fighting is frozen. Russia is progressing. Ukraine has nothing left. The United States doesn't even pretend that it does. And now there are rumors that they're trying to covertly push for peace, while, of course, maintaining the same stance that it always has. Russia, the aggressor. We're not going to ever sue for peace. There's going to be no peace until Ukraine wins everything. Right? So failure after failure, monumental ones. And then you have, of course, now China, where there was an opportunity to, with much time left in the elections, I predict that all of this was going to be unwritten anyway come the 2024 election. If you watched the 2020 election in the United States, then you know Joe Biden and Donald Trump vied and competed hard for who could be tougher on China. And so there's absolutely no hope for the United States to change anything policy-wise around that period, because the United States, both political parties, are going to use China as a political issue because they need to satisfy the neocons, the Pentagon, and all of it. They need to satisfy the neocon foreign policy establishment, the military contractors, for an election campaign, and aggression toward China is very profitable toward those ends. So this was always temporary anyway. But the fact that the Biden administration is likely to end its first and maybe only term in the White House with zero foreign policy signatures, zero foreign policy achievements. You had Obama with the Iran nuclear deal. You had Trump with his attempt to play at dynamics in the Korean Peninsula, which really opportunistically trying to take advantage of the fact that you had a South Korean government willing to negotiate with the DPRK for a normalization process. The fact that Donald Trump was able to do those things and Joe Biden can't seem to get anywhere with anything, I think goes to show that this has become a historic moment of crisis from which Biden was never prepared to address. And Biden himself, in my opinion, represents this conflict amongst the neocons, right? Represents this utter decline that the United States has found itself in and that China now has to deal with constantly. And many people wonder, why did Xi Jinping go to San Francisco? You could say now, yeah, good question, because the United States doesn't seem, or it never seems to be, a good faith actor, not even when it desperately needs to be one. Joe Biden desperately needed this. Joe Biden desperately needed something that gave the impression to the world that the United States is not just run by a bunch of warmongering lunatics. Seriously, this is important on the world stage. If there's something that you need to learn about geopolitics and maybe don't know yet, it's that how nation states, especially a system like the United States, which is predicated upon war and profiteering, right? This neoliberal imperial system, a system like that, it does matter how you look to the world. There's a reason why the United States constantly tries to position itself as the democracy of the world, as the leader of democracy, as a fighter for freedom, as as the kind of stable genocidaire, right? There's a reason why the United States does that as the hegemon, because the hegemon needs to look the part of a murderer in a nice suit, right? It has to look like Psycho, if you've ever seen that movie. You have to look like that, right? American Psycho. I don't know if anyone's watched that movie, but you got to look like that. You got to look the part, because if you don't, well, how are you even going to build support amongst your client states, let alone those peoples in those nations that are sick and tired of being under the thumb of US hegemony? You're not going to get it. The United States is even on a thin line when it comes to these so-called client states, these monarchies in the region, as low-key stated on this program. It's the fact that a lot of these monarchies have already been normal with Israel, have already kind of tied themselves up in knots around Israel, that makes it possible for both a process of reconciliation and normalization among countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia possible, while these same countries do very little on behalf of Palestine. It's because there's so much intertwined here, and Israel is very intertwined with the KSA, with the monarchy in Bahrain, and on and on and on. So the United States desperately needed a signature, desperately needed a victory. But how could the United States get a diplomatic victory with people like this? Look at this. This is pathetic. Mint Press News reported that in this same press conference, Joe Biden was asked about Israeli prisoners of war, and this is what he had to say.
We've gotten great cooperation from the Qataris. I've spoken with them as well a number of times. I think the pause, and that the Israelis have agreed to, it's down to, I'm getting too much detail. I know, Mr. Secretary, I'm going to stop. But I am mildly hopeful.
So, I mean, is there anything else to say? Joe Biden is not, he was never well. But really what this speaks to is that the neocon foreign policy establishment is not well. And why is it not well? Well, because it is partially headed by people like Joe Biden, who are not physically well, mentally well, let alone possessing of the leadership needed to do this kind of thing, manipulate situations, keep up a certain public relations image for the American empire. But here you have literally Joe Biden being directed by Antony Blinken. It's almost as if he is being propped up in more ways than we could have imagined, because We all know that US presidents who they work for, they don't work for people. They don't work for ordinary people. They work for big corporations, military contractors, warmongering careerists in the political establishment, lobby groups, etc. We go on and on and on. The point is, we know they don't work for us. But at the same time, to watch even the inability to function on that premise of needing to promote and project an image of the American empire, one that cloaks the American empire in democracy and stability and feasibility, desirability, all of these things are gone. They're gone. They have burst asunder, and they'll still remain gone regardless of who wins in 2024, Biden, Trump. It doesn't matter. We've listened to Donald Trump. If anyone's listened to Donald Trump up until this point, if the situation in Gaza is where it's at under Donald Trump, it's going to continue and maybe even worsen. That's just the rhetoric that's coming out. And if you don't believe Donald Trump, well, and you want to read into actions, just like Democrats read into actions that aren't actually true, read into words that aren't actually meaningful. I tend to believe Donald Trump when he says things like, a drop of American blood spilt will end up gallons of blood for you, when he's targeting Gaza. That's what he's talking about. I tend to believe him. And that's what's happening right now anyway. So why do we think it's going to change? In any event, the visit that Joe Biden conducted in China, or I mean the meeting between Xi Jinping and himself, Joe Biden, exposed a lot. It exposed, on the one hand, that the United States really is trying to project an image of stability, while at the same time possessing no capacity to actually do so. That face that you saw Antony Blinken express is not the face of someone who actually does have the ability to do this, who actually does have the skills required. No, Antony Blinken is not that. Look at what Antony Blinken has done. Goes to Kiev, goes to West Asia. What comes out of it? More of the same. No changes. Nothing. Just the same failures, the same catastrophes, just a different moment. And so when Antony Blinken makes that face, it's because even people like him understand how bad the situation is. You don't get moments like this very often. You're supposed to play a part in this. I'm surprised, actually. Actually, I'm not surprised, because everything I've said indicates that they're just not good at what they do. They're not good at playing a role. It's like watching a bad movie. And what's surprising, though, is that they're not even aware the movie is rolling. I mean, Joe Biden certainly isn't aware, but Antony Blinken, the neocons, they're not aware of which direction this movie is going, where the plot is going to end. It's not going to end in eternal U.S. supremacy. The more that the United States provokes China, the more likely it is that China will pursue self-reliance on its own. This is already happening. This is why Raimondo was so shocked about the Huawei Mate Pro 60. It's an astonishing accomplishment of self-reliance. It's why the United States cannot stop sanctioning Chinese tech, stop sanctioning China's renewable energy industry. It can't stop building up around Taiwan. Because on all of these questions, all of these issues are expressions of China's self-reliance, China's independent willingness and capacity to peacefully reunify with Taiwan, China's ability to build technology to address environmental issues, global climate catastrophe, all of that. China's ability to build up its own tech industry without the help of the United States. Has China's tech industry really been hampered? I mean, it's slowed down. There have been some developments where things have slowed down in certain sectors, including the chip industry. But at the same time, China is obviously accelerating in other areas, which is allowing it to do things like subvert sanctions. So the United States is what a lot of people call shooting itself in the foot. It did so with Russia with the sanctions. Russia's economy is stable. It's growing at a faster pace than Europe, almost twice as fast. These are the consequences of a failed imperial regime. The neocons are leading and sailing a sinking ship. And they don't even have the capacity to be aware of it because the compass is only pointing in one direction, and that is war and more war. And we have come to a juncture in history, and everything around US China relations exposes this, that the United States, the elite, the political class, the foreign policy establishment, whether they're aware of it or not, they don't have anything left but war. They have a massive military arsenal that they've outstretched in the Ukraine conflict. They weren't ready for that kind of war, but they've built up a military arsenal that allows them to continue on the path of conflict everywhere. And wherever it starts up, they're ready to go, even if they don't have enough to make a decisive decision to alter the course of history, right? They don't have the capacity to alter the course of history in West Asia. No, they're not defeating Iran, Hezbollah. Palestinian people will continue to resist. They don't have the ability to tip the scales there. They don't have the ability to tip the scales in Ukraine. Russia's going to win that war. They don't have the ability to tip the scales in the Asia Pacific. Most countries in the Asia Pacific, even so-called adversaries to China, South Korea, Japan, they are holding on for dear life to economic relations with China because they know that if they decouple from China, the economic deterioration they're already experiencing will only accelerate. There was a massive impact on South Korea, trade deficit forming in South Korea because of their willingness to go along with the US export ban of semiconductor technology. It's already harmed South Korea's economy. And both South Korea, Japan, even countries like the Philippines, which have a rogue leadership that are willing to provoke China in the South China Sea, they know that they need economic relations nonetheless. So the United States doesn't have the ability to tip the scales there. They've done everything they can. The governments of Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, I mean, these governments are as client state esque as as compliant and as loyal as they could be. Israel, look at what Israel is doing. As uh, uh, that's all that they're going to get is a regime like that leading the charge in the Israeli government. Ukraine didn't get any better than Zelensky. He did everything they said for him to do. And then when the going got rough, well, Zelensky got rough because he is not a talented person. Clients are not talented people. They're not. He's not a talented actor. He couldn't handle the pressure of what it meant for Russia to be making the progress that it had been making over the last months and months and months and months of this conflict. Didn't have the ability to face up to defeat. The United States, of course, is not a good teacher. It doesn't teach its pets and its puppets how to act. Look at Netanyahu. He's supposed to be a US puppet, believe me. But it's not the case. It's not the case. So regionally, everywhere, worldwide, this is what you call the end game, the end, the final act, the crumbling of the American empire. Antony Blinken's face is an expression of that. Antony Blinken's face shows us that the American empire is, in fact, crumbling, that there is nothing left that it can do to salvage its power, to salvage its hegemony. Antony Blinken's face is what most in the US foreign policy establishment are feeling. They can type up or they can go into interviews and play the part much better than Blinken. Blinken should have been paying attention to his face, to be honest. They can play the role. They can talk big, arrogantly, with the hubris, the exceptionalism. Oh, they can talk. But when it comes to the back rooms, these are the conversations they're having. What are we going to do? How are we going to make this work? Even The Economist is talking about, is American power dispensable? This is the question that's on the minds of a lot of the elite. This is why they are rapidly accelerating catastrophe after catastrophe. Ukraine, Gaza, China, right? What kind of catastrophe would that be? So US-China relations are really no better than they were before the APEC summit. And whatever small progress was made in establishing some concrete steps to changing policy, they have been undone by simple words from the Biden administration. The simple words of Xi Jinping is a dictator. To have very little awareness that such a comment essentially insults the very person that you had went to painstaking lengths to meet with. I mean, this was the invitation of the Biden administration. This was supposed to be Biden's moment. And to make those comments, whether he's aware of the fact that he was going to make them or not, whether he always had hoped and planned, whatever's going on in that addled brain of Joe Biden's, it doesn't really matter. The fact is that because it happened, we are exposed to the reality that it was never meant to be. There was never going to be improved relations. The overall trajectory of U.S. policy of the hegemon toward China is containment leading to war. Containment is always going to fail. War is the only pathway. That's why the U.S. continues to militarize the Asia Pacific, and that's why Taiwan continues to be a flashpoint. So I'll end with the face. We got to end with this face, all right? Let's end with the face of failure in the face of decline.
And after today, would you still refer to President Xi as a dictator? This is a term that you used earlier this year.
Well, he is. I mean, he's a dictator.
There it is. The face of failure in the face of decline. The face of a crumbling empire, crashing and burning, and attempting to take all of us with it. And the point is here is that we got to get rid of these people. We got to make sure that this order changes, and this order changes fast, so we don't all go down with it, because that's the ultimate pathway, especially for the collective West, which tends to think of itself as immune from what the United States and NATO, etc., do around the world. It's never been the case. We are all suffering for it as well. We are paying the price. That face is only an indication of where the elite sit right now. But the conditions that people are facing all over the world, Gaza is a manifestation of the most extreme form of cruelty, but that cruelty is happening all over the world, including in the collective West, where people are unable to meet basic needs in the most extravagantly so-called wealthy parts of the world, the so-called industrialized world. We're seeing the decline happen at all ends, in all spheres. And so that face is one that we need to never see again. So we got to get to it. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.